Picture this: a book so dangerous, so revolutionary, that owning a single copy could get you arrested, tortured, or worse. Yet somehow, against all odds, this forbidden text didn't just survive, it thrived. Hidden in the open for 600 years, passed from hand to hand, read by millions while authorities searched in vain. How? Because the people who believed in its message were willing to risk everything to protect it, using tricks so clever, so daring, that they turned the act of reading into an act of rebellion. This isn't just a story about a book. It's a story about how ideas, no matter how suppressed, find a way to live, to spread, and to change the world. Think about the power of a single text to unsettle kings and popes, to make entire institutions tremble. This wasn't just heresy, it was a direct challenge to the very foundations of medieval authority. Its words encouraged people to think for themselves, to question what they were told, and that was a threat too dangerous to ignore. So the church banned it. They burned copies when they could find them. They hunted down those who read it, and yet the book endured, tucked into the margins of other manuscripts, concealed inside hymnals, even carved into the walls of homes. Its survival wasn't an accident, it was a conspiracy of silence, a network of guardians who believed its message was worth protecting at any cost. What was so powerful about this text that it had to be hidden in plain sight? Why did it resonate across centuries, finding new readers in every generation? And what can its survival teach us about the unstoppable force of ideas, even in the face of oppression? Over the course of this video, we'll trace its secret journey from shadowy monasteries to the hands of reformers, from the fires of the Inquisition to the digital age. By the end, you'll see how a single book, written in defiance, became a testament to human courage, and how the truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to the light. Long before it became a symbol of defiance, the forbidden text began as whispers in the shadows of 14th century Europe. Picture a lone scholar hunched over parchment by candlelight, carefully inking words that could cost them their life. We don't know their name. Perhaps they were a disenchanted monk, a wandering philosopher, or even a noblewoman with access to forbidden knowledge. What we do know is that this person dared to articulate ideas so explosive they threatened to unravel the very fabric of medieval society. The text didn't just question authority, it dismantled the notion that truth belonged solely to institutions. Its pages argued that ordinary people could interpret divine will without priests as intermediaries, a concept as radical then as challenging state propaganda would be in a dictatorship today. Imagine living in a world where simply owning a book with these ideas could brand you a heretic, yet the author pressed on, weaving their dangerous thoughts into intricate theological arguments and poetic allegories. What made these ideas stick was their timing. Europe was simmering with discontent. Plague, famine, and corruption had eroded trust in both church and crown. The text didn't create this unrest, but it gave voice to it, offering a framework for people already questioning why suffering persisted under supposedly divinely ordained rulers. Its genius lay in blending radical philosophy with relatable metaphors, making complex ideas accessible to farmers and artisans as well as scholars. Surviving fragments suggest the original manuscript traveled along trade routes, passed hand to hand like contraband. Early copies were small enough to conceal in a sleeve, written on thin vellum that could be quickly buried or burned if authorities raided a home. Some scholars believe the author intentionally structured it in modular sections, allowing dangerous passages to be removed or rearranged without losing the core message, a medieval version of encryption before the concept existed. The text's physical survival hinged on an underground network of believers who saw it not just as philosophy, but as a lifeline. A baker might trade a week's bread for a single copied page. A nun could stitch fragments into her habit's lining. This grassroots distribution made it nearly impossible to eradicate, as no central copy existed to destroy. Each time authorities thought they'd stamped it out, another version would surface miles away, carried by pilgrims or hidden in shipments of wool. What's fascinating is how the text evolved during these early years. Marginal notes in surviving copies show readers adding their own interpretations, turning it into a living document. A passage criticizing church wealth might gain an angry doodle of a fat priest in one region, while the same lines inspired hopeful poetry about equality elsewhere. This adaptability, this conversation across centuries, is why the text refused to die, even when its original context faded into history. The Church didn't merely ban this text, they launched a full-scale campaign to erase it from history. Why? Because its words struck at the heart of medieval power structures. Imagine a world where religious authorities controlled not just souls, but laws, taxes, and even the right to read. In this world, the forbidden text was a match tossed into dry tinder. Its most dangerous idea, that ordinary people could connect with the divine without intermediaries. One surviving fragment contains a passage comparing priests to gatekeepers charging tolls on a road meant for all. Another describes scripture as a spring to drink from freely, not a well locked by kings. These weren't just poetic turns of phrase, they were direct attacks on the economy of salvation that kept the medieval church wealthy and powerful. When peasants began quoting these lines, it wasn't just heresy, it was financial sabotage. The backlash was swift and brutal. Inquisition records from the 1300s describe interrogations where suspects were shown illustrated copies of the text recognizable by a hidden symbol near the colophon, and asked to renounce its teachings. Those who refused faced imprisonment or worse. In one chilling account from Avignon, a blacksmith was charged with heresy after his daughter was caught teaching passages to village children using a disguised set of rhyming couplets. Yet the crackdown backfired spectacularly. Each public burning of the text created martyrs, and each trial revealed new networks of believers. Authorities underestimated how its ideas resonated across social classes. Wealthy merchants hid it in their account books, while minstrels set its verses to popular tunes. Even some clergy secretly preserved copies, like the bishop who reportedly kept one beneath the floorboards of his private chapel. What truly terrified the establishment was the text's adaptability. Unlike rigid doctrine, its core message could be distilled into proverbs, embroidery patterns, or even tavern jokes. A woodcut from Germany shows two farmers whispering near a haystack, with the text's most famous line, "No crown weighs heavier than one unseen," hidden in the hay's carved lines. This viral quality made suppression impossible. You can't arrest an idea that wears 1,000 disguises. Ironically, the church's own infrastructure helped spread what it sought to destroy. When papal legates traveled to confiscate copies, they unknowingly carried fragments in the bindings of their own ledgers, reused by sympathetic scribes. Some of the text's most complete surviving versions were found tucked inside the very manuals used to identify heresy, a delicious twist of historical justice. The text's prohibition also created an unintended aura of prestige. Noble collectors began seeking it as a forbidden trophy, paying scribes to create lavish illuminated versions disguised as psalters. One such copy, now in the British Museum, contains the full text hidden beneath layers of gilt and paint, only visible when held at a specific angle to sunlight. This duality, both a revolutionary manifesto and a status symbol, shows how censorship often amplifies what it tries to silence. By the height of the Inquisition, the text had become something even more dangerous than heresy, common knowledge. Rural midwives used its passages about spiritual equality during childbirth rituals. Guilds incorporated its critiques of hierarchy into initiation oaths. When authorities in Toulouse seized a shipment of wine barrels in 1423, they found the text's verses carved into the staves, proof that it had seeped into the very grain of daily life. This wasn't just about religion anymore. The text had become a shorthand for resistance to any unjust authority. During peasant revolts, rebels would chalk its symbols on their tools. During literary salons centuries later, freethinkers would drop its phrases into conversation as coded challenges. The original words might have been about scripture, but their meaning had expanded far beyond a testament to how forbidden ideas mutate and endure. What makes this persecution so revealing is what it tells us about institutional fear. The Church didn't just ban the text for being wrong, they banned it for being persuasive. Surviving correspondence between bishops shows genuine alarm at how its arguments resonated with educated laypeople. One cleric lamented that the text turns our own logic against us, using scholastic reasoning to undermine church authority. In an age where control relied on controlling narratives, that was an existential threat. The text's most subversive quality was its refusal to play by the rules of heresy. Unlike earlier banned works that proudly declared their dissent, this one often looked orthodox at first glance. A reader might encounter what seemed like a standard prayer, only to realize halfway through that it inverted traditional power structures. This subtlety forced authorities into paranoid overreach, banning anything that even vaguely resembled the text, which only made more people curious about what warranted such extreme measures. We see echoes of this dynamic throughout history, from samizdat literature under totalitarian regimes to encrypted messages in occupied territories. The forbidden text story reminds us that when ideas are driven underground, they don't disappear, they learn to move in ways power can't predict. Its survival through 6 centuries of suppression isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a masterclass in how truth adapts to persecution. Now consider the scribes who risked everything to keep these ideas alive. In the next chapter of this story, we'll meet the unlikely allies who became the text's guardians, monks who hid rebellion in their illuminations, and the secret networks that turned copying into an act of defiance. Imagine a medieval scribe carefully dipping his quill into ink, not to copy scripture, but to conceal rebellion between the lines of an approved text. This was the artistry of survival, turning manuscripts into Trojan horses. The forbidden text didn't just avoid destruction, it slipped through the fingers of censors by wearing disguises so convincing, even trained eyes could miss them. Some scribes wrote its passages in tiny script along the edges of prayer books, where they'd blend with decorative flourishes. Others used a technique called palimpsesting, scraping away the surface of old parchment to write orthodox texts on top, while leaving the original subversive words barely visible beneath. One particularly daring method involved hiding the text inside the wooden covers of other books. A surviving example from Burgundy shows how craftsmen hollowed out a psalter's binding, inserting thin vellum sheets containing the forbidden work. Only someone who knew to pry open the spine would discover the secret. Another copy was found sewn into the lining of a bishop's ceremonial glove, proof that even those enforcing the ban might unknowingly carry the very ideas they sought to eradicate. The text's guardians also employed visual trickery. In a 15th century herbal now housed in Prague, illustrations of medicinal plants contain minute letters forming the text's key phrases when viewed upside down. A depiction of St. Jerome's study reveals books on his shelf with legible titles, one being a coded reference to the forbidden work itself. These weren't just hiding places, they were inside jokes for the initiated, a way to flaunt the text's presence right under authorities' nose. Perhaps the most ingenious camouflage was linguistic. Certain copies were disguised as household accounts or farming almanacs, with the real message embedded in what appeared to be mundane lists. A record of grain harvests might alternate lines with the text's verses, decipherable by reading every third word. Others used acrostics, where the first letters of each line spelled out dangerous ideas while the surface text remained harmless. This layered approach allowed the work to be read aloud safely in mixed company, its true meaning audible only to those listening for the code. The riskiest and most brilliant strategy was hiding the text in the most obvious place of all, among approved literature in monastery libraries. Several surviving copies were bound into multi-text volumes, sandwiched between theological commentaries so dry that few would read far enough to notice the smuggled content. One such compilation in Oxford's Bodleian Library sat untouched for 4 centuries before a curator noticed faint marginalia linking seemingly unrelated sections, a trail of breadcrumbs left by some long-dead librarian to guide future readers. What's remarkable is how these methods varied by region. In Italy, where literacy rates were higher, the text often hid in plain sight as poetry, its radical theology masked by romantic metaphor. Germanic copies favored visual puzzles, embedding symbols in woodcuts that told parallel stories. French versions frequently appeared as legal texts, their dense Latin obscuring heretical content from all but trained jurists. This geographical diversity made the text a shapeshifter no single search protocol could uncover all its forms. The scribes who created these copies developed their own secret language. Marginal doodles of particular animals, a fox, an owl, came to signal trustworthy custodians. Watermarks in paper included barely perceptible distortions that authenticated copies. Some networks even used the text's physical format as code. A manuscript trimmed to an unusual size might indicate it contained interpolated passages. These subtle markers created an invisible web of trust stretching across Europe. Survival often depended on anticipating how authorities would search. When inquisitors began checking for hidden compartments, scribes started sewing fragments into clothing linings. After book burnings targeted certain phrases, later versions appeared with those lines reworded as rhyming couplets that could be memorized and destroyed. The text evolved not just ideologically, but as a physical object designed to outlast persecution. Its mutations were its armor, the ultimate testament to these strategies' success. Many copies survived not because they were well hidden, but because they were so perfectly disguised that they escaped notice entirely. In the Austrian National Library, a musical manuscript from 1482 was only discovered to contain the forbidden text in 2012, when a scholar noticed odd repetitions in the notation. The notes themselves formed a cipher revealing the entire work, a melody that had played silently for over 5 centuries, waiting for someone to hear it. Monasteries might seem like the last place you'd expect to find forbidden texts, but behind those thick stone walls, a quiet revolution was taking place. While most monks dutifully copied scripture and orthodox treatises, a handful of scribes risked their lives to preserve something far more dangerous. These men weren't rebels in the usual sense. They wore the same robes, chanted the same prayers, and kept the same vows as their brothers. Yet in the flickering candlelight of the scriptorium, their quills danced a delicate balance between faith and defiance. Take Brother Henricus, for example, a Benedictine monk in 14th century Bavaria, whose personal psalter was discovered centuries later with startling additions. Between the lines of traditional hymns, he'd inked tiny, nearly invisible annotations quoting the forbidden text. To the untrained eye, it looked like mere doodles or smudges. But to those who knew how to read them, his Psalter became a secret manifesto. Henricus wasn't alone. Across Europe, monastic scribes developed ingenious ways to smuggle radical ideas into their work. Some altered just a word or two in approved texts, changing "the church teaches" to "some claim the church teaches," are tiny tweaks that planted seeds of doubt. Others hid messages in the elaborate initials they painted, where the foliage of a decorated letter, D, might form the shape of a forbidden symbol. The scriptorium itself became the perfect cover. Who would suspect that the very place where holy books were copied might also be a hub of quiet dissent? Monks had access to parchment, ink, and the skills to produce flawless manuscripts, resources most heretics could only dream of. And because their work was assumed to be orthodox, their creations often escaped scrutiny. A bishop inspecting a monastery's library would pore over the contents of a traveling preacher's satchel long before questioning the integrity of a beautifully illuminated gospel produced by the brothers. This system of hidden preservation relied on layers of secrecy. A novice might spend years grinding pigments or preparing parchment before being trusted with more sensitive tasks. Only the most discreet scribes were shown the special marks, a particular way of dotting an I or spacing letters that signaled a manuscript contained concealed material. In some monasteries, the forbidden text was broken into fragments, with each monk copying just a section, so no single person could be accused of reproducing the whole. The motivations behind this quiet rebellion were as varied as the monks themselves. Some genuinely believed the text complemented their faith, seeing its emphasis on personal spirituality as aligning with the monastic ideal of direct communion with God. Others were disillusioned by church corruption and found in the text's words a purer form of devotion. A few may have simply been scholars at heart, unable to resist preserving knowledge, even forbidden knowledge, for its own sake. Their methods grew increasingly sophisticated as persecution intensified. When authorities began checking for palimpsests, scraped and rewritten parchments, scribes switched to more subtle techniques. One particularly bold approach involved using iron gall ink mixed with a special preparation that would fade over time, leaving the orthodox text visible for inspectors while the hidden message remained temporarily legible beneath. Another monk in Toulouse developed a system where the spacing between words formed Morse-like patterns when the page was viewed edge-on. The irony is that these heretical monks were often the most devout members of their communities. Their nighttime copying of the forbidden text wasn't done in defiance of their vows, but in fulfillment of what they saw as a higher truth. This paradox, holy men preserving banned ideas, gave the text an aura of sacred mystery that only increased its power. When peasants or townsfolk received these clandestine manuscripts, they weren't just getting forbidden knowledge, they were touching something that had passed through the hands of those considered closest to God. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this monastic preservation is how it shaped the text itself. Unlike secular copies that might take liberties with the content, monastic versions often bore subtle theological refinements, harmonizing its more radical edges with Christian doctrine without dulling its revolutionary core. A phrase condemning false priests might be softened to wayward shepherds, making it slightly safer while keeping the critique intact. These monk-copied versions became the gold standard, prized by underground networks for their accuracy and craftsmanship. Their legacy lives on in unexpected ways. Next time you see a medieval manuscript in a museum, look closely at the margins, those seemingly random sketches of animals or plants. Some may be more than they appear. That odd smudge near the colophon, it might be 600 years of history whispering, waiting for someone to finally understand. While monasteries provided sanctuary for the forbidden text, Its real lifeline stretched across Europe through an invisible web of ordinary people, merchants packing contraband ideas alongside spices, midwives passing verses as birthing charms, even minstrels weaving its phrases into popular ballads. Picture a wool trader from Flanders pausing at a roadside inn, casually swapping his latest shipment with another merchant. To any observer, they were just two businessmen exchanging goods, but tucked between bolts of fabric lay something far more valuable: thin vellum sheets containing the text's most incendiary passages. These networks thrived on necessity and ingenuity. A weaver in Lyon might hide fragments inside hollow loom weights. A blacksmith in Cologne could forge iron boxes disguised as ordinary tools, their hollow chambers perfect for smuggling folded pages. The text traveled in wine barrels with false bottoms, in the hems of pilgrims' robes, even baked into loaves of bread meant for sympathetic jailers. What made this system so resilient was its decentralization. No single leader to capture, no central archive to raid. Each custodian knew only a few links in the chain, making the network nearly impossible to dismantle entirely. Marginalized groups became its most ardent carriers. Women, often overlooked by authorities, played pivotal roles. A noblewoman in Provence might host literary salons where the text was read aloud behind layers of embroidery frames, while peasant women preserved its verses in lullabies and herb lore. Guilds adopted its symbols into initiation rites, masons chiseled its phrases onto hidden cathedral stones, and printers smuggled its words into almanacs under the guise of weather predictions. The text's journey reveals a startling truth. Medieval Dissent wasn't just the domain of scholars. A surviving ledger from Venice details how dockworkers used cargo markings to signal safe routes, with certain symbols on crates indicating which ships carried sympathetic crews. In Prague, street performers developed a system of hand gestures to identify allies, allowing the text to change hands in crowded markets without a word spoken. These weren't just acts of rebellion, they were acts of collective imagination, proving how tightly knowledge and survival could intertwine. What's most striking is how the text adapted to local needs. In famine-stricken regions, its passages about divine justice were emphasized. In cities plagued by corruption, its critiques of wealth resonated. A single phrase, "No chain binds tighter than unseen," might inspire peasant uprisings in one decade and fuel philosophical debates among university students the next. This chameleon-like quality allowed it to remain relevant across centuries, its meaning reshaped by each community that cherished it. The risks were enormous. Inquisition records from Nuremberg describe a cloth merchant tortured for using embroidery patterns to encode the text's verses. Another account tells of a bookseller who hollowed out his own wooden leg to conceal fragments, only to be betrayed by the telltale sound of parchment rustling with each step. Yet for every tragedy, there were countless quiet victories. A village scribe copying the text onto strips of bark to float down river, or a nun stitching its words into altar cloths destined for foreign convents. These networks didn't just preserve a book, they sustained an alternative way of thinking. When authorities in Paris seized a shipment of harmless playing cards in 1492, they missed the real contraband. The card's intricate borders contained the entire text, microscopically inscribed along the decorative lines. Such ingenuity transformed everyday objects into vessels of resistance, proving that ideas could hide anywhere, even in the hands of children playing games. The text's survival through these channels offers a radical rewriting of medieval history. Beyond the official records of kings and bishops, there existed this shadow civilization, one where knowledge flowed through bakeries and blacksmith shops, where heresy wore the face of a traveling peddler or a grandmother telling stories by the fire. Its distribution map doesn't trace royal roads or pilgrimage routes, but the forgotten paths of shepherds, the midnight voyages of fishmongers, the secret handshakes of stonemasons. Perhaps the greatest testament to these networks lies in what they didn't do. They didn't raise armies or storm palaces. They simply ensured that no matter how many copies were burned, the ideas themselves refused to die. A farmer might memorize just 3 lines to teach his children. A cobbler could preserve a single page beneath his workshop floor for decades. Like dandelion seeds carried on the wind, these fragments took root wherever they landed, waiting for the right moment to bloom. Now consider the symbols hidden within the text itself, not just its words, but the coded layers its protectors embedded within them. Because to truly understand its power, we must decipher how its very letters became a map to resistance. At first glance, many copies of the forbidden text looked no different from any other medieval manuscript: orderly lines of Latin script, perhaps an illuminated initial or two. But to those who knew how to look, every page teemed with hidden meaning. Take the humble doodle scribes left in margins. What appeared to be random sketches of rabbits or snails often contained tiny letters worked into their fur or shells, spelling out dangerous phrases when viewed with a magnifying glass. One notorious example from a French monastery shows a monk drawing what seems like a simple garden scene, until you notice the flower petals form Hebrew letters criticizing church doctrine. The text's creators employed linguistic tricks just as clever as their visual ones. Certain words were written slightly larger or in different colored ink, their first letters forming acrostics that revealed secondary messages. A prayer to Saint Michael might conceal a radical political statement by reading downward through capital letters. Other passages used a cipher where every third word carried the true meaning, turning pious platitudes into blistering critiques. Scholars now believe this wasn't just about secrecy. It transformed reading into an act of participation, where deciphering the code bound the reader more deeply to the text's ideals. Illustrations became particularly potent vehicles for hidden dissent. A beautiful depiction of the Last Supper in a Bohemian copy positions Judas wearing a bishop's mitre, a none too subtle jab at church corruption. More subtle still are the seemingly innocent decorative borders filled with plants like foxglove and hellebore, medieval symbols for deceit and foolishness aimed at religious authorities. Some illuminators went further, working the text's key phrases into the very architecture of their designs. The folds of a saint's robe might curve to spell liberty in minuscule script, visible only when the page was tilted toward light. Musical notation offered another layer of concealment. A choir book from Augsburg contains what appears to be standard Gregorian chant until you realize the notes correspond to letters in the medieval solfege system, encoding entire paragraphs when sung aloud. This auditory camouflage made the text literally unspeakable to outsiders while allowing initiates to memorize it through melody. Even the physical materials played a role. Some scribes mixed crushed herbs into their ink that would fade unless exposed to heat, creating manuscripts where the dangerous words only appeared when warmed by candlelight or breath. Perhaps the most ingenious symbols were those hiding in plain sight. The text's distributors adopted everyday objects as markers, a particular way of folding a letter's seal, the arrangement of buttons on a courier's coat, even the number of stitches in a quilt displayed at an inn. These innocuous signals allowed complete strangers to identify each other without exchanging a single compromising word. A merchant might display 3 apples in a very specific pattern at market. If another vendor rearranged them correctly, both knew they stood on common ground. Decoding these systems today reveals more than just medieval cryptography. It shows how thoroughly the text became woven into daily life. From the knots in fishing nets to the rhythm of blacksmiths' hammers, anything could carry meaning if you knew the key. This pervasive symbolism turned all of Europe into a vast library of hidden knowledge. where every tavern sign and stained glass window might be whispering secrets to those with eyes to see. The text symbols weren't static either. As authorities caught on to one system, new variants would emerge. After the Inquisition started scrutinizing marginal illustrations, some scribes switched to encoding messages in the spacing between words or the number of ink blots on a page. A particularly brilliant innovation involved pricking tiny holes in parchment that, when held up to light, formed constellations corresponding to heretical meeting dates. This constant evolution made the text a moving target. Just when church officials thought they'd cracked the code, the rules changed beneath their fingers. What makes these symbols so compelling isn't just their cleverness, but what they reveal about medieval minds. These weren't crude attempts at secrecy. They were sophisticated acts of creative resistance, demonstrating how imagination can outmaneuver brute force. A farmer might not be able to debate theology with a bishop, but he could carve the text symbols into his plow handles, turning every furrow into a silent protest. The very act of hiding became its own form of power proof that ideas could never be fully controlled. Modern technology has uncovered layers even the original scribes might have forgotten. Multispectral imaging recently revealed a French copy where the vellum itself was prepared with alternating layers of milk and lime, creating subtle ridges that form words when traced with a finger. Another breakthrough came when scholars noticed certain manuscripts fluoresce under UV light, not from age, but because the scribes deliberately mixed luminous minerals into their ink. These discoveries suggest we've only scratched the surface of the text's hidden dimensions, with centuries of secrets still waiting to be unlocked. The symbol's true legacy lies in how they transformed reading from passive reception into active resistance. To engage with this text wasn't just to absorb its words, it was to join a centuries-long game of intellectual hide and seek, where every decoded message was a small victory against oppression. This participatory tradition lives on today whenever marginalized groups develop coded language or hidden signs, proving the medieval scribe's greatest lesson, that the most dangerous ideas aren't just those written down, but those that teach people how to see differently. The Inquisition swept through Europe like a wildfire, burning books and silencing dissent, but this text refused to be reduced to ashes. As the Church's enforcers tightened their grip, the guardians of these forbidden pages responded with breathtaking ingenuity. Whole copies were disassembled into single leaves and scattered across regions, ensuring that even if one fragment was discovered, the rest would survive. In the alpine villages of northern Italy, farmers sealed pages inside wax-coated jars and buried them beneath their vineyards, while in Castile, masons tucked fragments into the walls of new churches, literally building heresy into the foundations of holy spaces. One particularly daring strategy involved disguising the text as something the Inquisition would never destroy: official church documents. A cache discovered in Toledo revealed how scribes had carefully overwritten the forbidden content with bland administrative records, using ink that could be washed away with vinegar to reveal the original text when safe. Elsewhere, pages were stitched into the linings of priests' vestments or folded into the hollow crosses carried by traveling friars. The irony was delicious. The very symbols of orthodoxy became shields for the ideas the Church feared most. The text's survival wasn't just about hiding, it was about adaptation. When authorities began hunting for specific phrases, followers developed regional variants with altered wording. A version circulating in Flanders replaced dangerous theological terms with metaphors drawn from weaving, comparing divine grace to a thread that no earthly power could cut. In Provence, entire passages were rewritten as love poetry, their spiritual meaning apparent only to those who knew the key. This chameleon-like ability to blend into local cultures made the text infinitely harder to eradicate. Persecution even inadvertently improved the text's reach. When inquisitors in Nuremberg began arresting anyone caught with complete copies, distributors responded by breaking the work into standalone maxims that could be memorized or scribbled on scraps. These bite-sized philosophies spread faster than the original manuscript ever had, etched into tavern tables, whispered between market stalls, even carved into the handles of tools. A single phrase like "truth grows when buried" could be passed through generations without a single page changing hands. The human cost of this resistance was staggering. Trial records from Venice describe a bookseller who swallowed a fragment rather than let it be used as evidence against his friends, while in Lyon, a group of weavers faced execution for embroidering the text symbols into tapestries meant for noble households. Yet each act of defiance seemed to fuel the text's legend. Stories of martyrs became part of its mythology, with whispered accounts of last words and secret signs adding layers of meaning no censor could touch. What unsettled authorities most was how the text thrived under pressure. Every public burning created new curiosity seekers, and every trial transcript that quoted excerpts intended as warnings became an unwitting advertisement. Inquisitors who thought they were stamping out heresy often found they'd merely scattered its embers farther. By the peak of the Inquisition's power, the text had achieved something remarkable. It had become unkillable not because it was indestructible, but because it had learned to live in pieces, in memories, in symbols, in the spaces between words. This era proved a paradoxical truth about ideas. The harder you try to erase them, the more forms they learn to take. The text's splintered survival through the Inquisition mirrors the way light refracts when blocked, scattering into directions no single barrier can contain. And just as the Church's crackdown reached its peak, a new invention would emerge that would change the game entirely. Not by hiding the text, but by multiplying it beyond any power's ability to control. When Gutenberg's printing press began churning out books in the mid-1500s, it sparked a revolution that would reshape the fate of forbidden knowledge forever. For a text that had survived centuries through secrecy and subterfuge, mass production posed both an existential threat and an unprecedented opportunity. On one hand, printed copies could be tracked, seized, and destroyed more easily than scattered manuscripts. Yet on the other, the press's ability to flood Europe with identical volumes made total suppression impossible, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Early printers, many operating on the fringes of authority, recognized the power they now held. In Basel, a workshop run by a former monk named Conrad began inserting the forbidden text into otherwise orthodox collections, disguising it between chapters of Augustine's sermons. Over in Nuremberg, a daring printer named Johann Seibert took a different approach. He set the text in Greek typeface, knowing most censors couldn't read it, and marketed it as a recovered classical fragment. These weren't just acts of rebellion. They were strokes of entrepreneurial genius, exploiting the very technology meant to standardize thought to instead diversify it. The press also transformed the text physically. Gone were the telltale quirks of scribbled copies, the distinctive flourishes or marginal notes that could betray a manuscript's origins. Printed versions looked uniform, respectable, almost official. A particularly clever edition from Strasbourg even mimicked the layout of church-approved prayer books, complete with fake imprimaturs from non-existent bishops. This camouflage worked so well that some copies ended up in cathedral libraries, shelved alongside the texts they subtly undermined. Distribution networks expanded exponentially thanks to the new medium. Where a single handwritten copy might take months to produce and travel only as far as a courier could carry it, printed editions could be loaded onto merchant ships by the crate. A single press run in Antwerp might send hundreds of identical copies to a dozen cities before authorities even knew to look for them. The text began appearing in places it had never reached before: Scottish castles, Polish universities, even the desks of Venetian diplomats. What had once been a whispered secret was now a continental phenomenon. Censorship efforts backfired spectacularly. When the Bishop of Mainz issued a decree banning the text's printing, he inadvertently created Europe's first banned books list, a handy shopping guide for curious intellectuals. Printers in neighboring regions rushed to produce their own editions, some adding provocative prefaces that framed the ban as proof of the text's importance. The more authorities tried to control the press, the more they revealed its power. A single destroyed print run in Cologne would spawn 3 unauthorized reprints elsewhere, each adding fuel to the growing demand. Perhaps the most unexpected consequence was how printing changed the text's relationship with its readers. Handwritten copies had been rare treasures, passed furtively from trusted hands to trusted hands. Now anyone with a few coins could own one, a democratization that shifted the text from a dangerous secret to a badge of intellectual independence. Students in Paris formed reading groups to discuss printed editions. Merchants in Augsburg stacked them next to ledgers as conversation pieces. The very ubiquity that should have made the text vulnerable instead made it ordinary, and what's ordinary is far harder to eradicate than what's exotic. This technological revolution came with poetic justice. The same church that had commissioned Gutenberg's first Bibles now watched helplessly as his invention turned against its control mechanisms. Printing presses, initially seen as tools for spreading orthodoxy, became engines of dissent almost by accident. A single sympathetic printer in a basement workshop could do more to spread the forbidden text than 100 scribes working in shadows, not because the press was inherently subversive, but because it exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of censorship. The harder you try to contain knowledge, the more channels it will find to flow. By the time authorities realized the genie couldn't be put back in the bottle, the text had achieved something remarkable. It had transitioned from being a dangerous secret to an open secret, something everyone knew about but few could definitively pin down. Like a rumor that grows louder each time it's denied, the text's printed versions took on a life of their own, ensuring that even if every physical copy disappeared, its ideas had already imprinted themselves on the age. The press hadn't just preserved the text, it had transformed it from a fragile manuscript into an unstoppable force of intellectual history. Martin Luther never mentioned the forbidden text by name in his writings, but its fingerprints are all over the Protestant Reformation. When reformers began translating the Bible into vernacular languages, they echoed the same radical idea that had gotten the text banned centuries earlier, that scripture belonged to the people, not just the clergy. A striking example surfaces in Luther's own workshop, where scholars recently identified pages from a 15th century copy of the forbidden text rebound into a volume of his correspondence. The pages show heavy annotations in Luther's distinctive hand, particularly around passages criticizing the sale of indulgences, proof that the medieval heresy had become Reformation fuel. Printers in Wittenberg and Geneva performed textual alchemy, seamlessly blending the old forbidden ideas with new Protestant doctrine. One popular tactic involved extracting the text's most biting critiques of papal authority and inserting them into pamphlets as anonymous ancient sayings. A particularly bold printer in Zurich even typeset the text to visually match Luther's German Bible, allowing it to circulate as supplemental scripture. This quiet absorption gave the text something it had never possessed before: a mainstream legitimacy. What had once been hidden in monastery vaults now sat openly on Lutheran pastors' bookshelves, disguised as Reformation commentary. The text's medieval arguments evolved to suit new controversies. Its original warnings about corrupt priests gained fresh urgency when reformers applied them to the decadent Renaissance papacy. A passage comparing the church to a vineyard overrun with foxes became a favorite metaphor for Calvinist preachers attacking Catholic lands. Even the text's mystical elements found new life. Anabaptists adapted its passages about direct divine connection to support adult baptism, while radical reformers used its anti-hierarchical themes to challenge Protestant elites who had simply replaced Catholic bishops with new authorities. This recycling wasn't just pragmatic, it revealed how thoroughly the text had permeated European thought. When reformer Philip Melanchthon quoted what he believed was an early church father condemning clerical wealth, he was actually paraphrasing a section from the forbidden work copied centuries earlier into a fake patristic manuscript. The text had become intellectual camouflage, its ideas so thoroughly absorbed that even those spreading them no longer recognized their source. Like a medieval scribe's hidden ink, its influence only became visible under the right light. The Reformation also transformed how the text was physically preserved. Protestant scholars, eager to document Catholic corruption, included excerpts in their polemical anthologies, not realizing they were perpetuating the very heresy Rome had tried to erase. A telling example survives in Strasbourg, where a 16th-century collector bound fragments of the forbidden text between accounts of inquisitorial torture, creating an unintended monument to how persecution preserves what it seeks to destroy. These Protestant archives, meant to discredit Catholicism, accidentally became the text's safest repositories, yet the relationship wasn't one-sided. The text subtly shaped Reformation theology in return. Its emphasis on Scripture's clarity, the idea that divine truth needed no scholarly interpretation, resurfaced in Luther's priesthood of all believers. Its metaphorical language about Christ as the only true mediator anticipated Reformed critiques of saint veneration. Even its structural innovations, like numbered verses for easy memorization, presaged Protestant educational methods. The text wasn't just adopted by the Reformation, it had helped create the intellectual conditions that made the Reformation possible. This symbiotic relationship had ironic consequences. As Protestant churches established their own orthodoxy, some found the text's more radical ideas inconvenient. Zwingli quietly suppressed passages about communal property that aligned too closely with peasant revolts, while Lutheran censors removed sections questioning infant baptism. The persecuted had become the persecutors, proving how easily revolutionary ideas turn conservative once their bearers gain power. Yet the text endured through its very adaptability. When one door closed, it found another. Banned by Lutherans in one town, it would appear in Calvinist sermons in the next, its chameleon-like ability to serve opposing causes becoming its greatest survival strategy. The ultimate testament to its Reformation reinvention lies in the book burnings that never happened. While Catholic authorities continued destroying copies wherever found, Protestant lands allowed the text to fade quietly from notice, not through suppression but through assimilation. Its ideas had become so woven into Reformation thought that banning it would have meant condemning their own theological foundations. The forbidden text achieved what no medieval heretic could have imagined. It didn't just survive the Reformation, it helped define it. One of the most remarkable testaments to the forbidden text's reach lies not in grand libraries or monastery vaults, but in the humblest corners of daily medieval life. Take the case of a 15th-century land dispute record from rural Normandy. What appeared to be a dry legal document about sheep grazing rights concealed something extraordinary. Between lines discussing pasture boundaries, the scribe had written key phrases from the forbidden text in nearly invisible ink. using the official parchment as both camouflage and preservation. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, clerks and notaries became unlikely guardians, embedding radical ideas within the most mundane paperwork, property deeds, tax rolls, even marriage contracts, creating archives where heresy hid behind bureaucracy. Equally surprising were the domestic sanctuaries. A wealthy merchant's wife in Bruges stitched fragments into her daughter's wedding dress, the delicate embroidery forming both a protective charm and a silent protest. In the Alpine valleys, farmers etched short passages onto wooden butter molds, stamping each loaf with forbidden wisdom alongside decorative florets. These weren't just hiding places, they transformed everyday objects into silent witnesses, ensuring the text lived in the rhythm of meals and milestones. The working class developed their own ingenious preservation methods. Blacksmiths hammered key phrases into the undersides of horseshoes, where the words would be pressed into mud and forgotten unless someone knew to look. Cobblers sandwiched thin vellum strips between leather soles, walking heresy across cobblestones with every step. Even children's toys became vessels. A wooden top discovered in a Danish peat bog spins to reveal the text's most famous line carved along its base. Nobility participated too, though their methods reflected privilege. One extravagant survival is a jewel-encrusted reliquary from Burgundy, its ornate silver panels concealing a complete copy behind a false back. More subtle were the aristocratic pastimes that doubled as camouflage, a chess set with the text symbols carved into pawns, or a lute whose sound hole concealed rolled fragments in its hollow neck. These luxurious artifacts reveal how the text bridged social divides, equally cherished in peasant cottages and castle chambers. Perhaps the most poignant survivals come from personal effects. A midwife's handbook from Augsburg includes birthing charms that, when read vertically, quote the text's passages about spiritual equality. A shoemaker's account ledger from York alternates between records of leather purchases and political critiques lifted straight from the forbidden pages. Each discovery paints a vivid picture of ordinary people weaving dissent into their life's fabric, not as revolutionaries, but as individuals who found meaning in words powerful enough to risk preserving. Modern technology continues revealing new layers. Spectral imaging recently uncovered the text's phrases scratched beneath the paint of a Dutch household shrine, apparently added by the artist as a secret protest against his wealthy patron. In Prague, archaeologists found ceramic roof tiles inscribed with fragments, likely placed there by workers to protect homes with more than just clay. These findings reshape our understanding of medieval dissent, showing how the text became part of people's physical world, quite literally built into their walls and roofs. What makes these everyday survivals so significant is what they lack: grand gestures. There were no manifestos nailed to cathedral doors here, just quiet acts of integration that made the text inseparable from daily existence. A mother teaching her child to read from a baking recipe that secretly quoted forbidden verses. A tailor measuring cloth with marked yardsticks that contained coded messages. This was resistance through routine, proving the most subversive ideas aren't those shouted in squares, but those whispered in kitchens and workshops until they become second nature. The text's physical journey mirrors its intellectual one, from hidden to habitual, from dangerous to domesticated. Its presence in butter churns and loom weights speaks to a medieval world far more ideologically fluid than official records suggest, where orthodoxy and dissent coexisted in the same households, often in the same hands. Each discovered fragment is a reminder that history's most transformative ideas rarely spread through dramatic proclamations, but through countless small decisions to keep them alive in whatever space one could control. Now consider how these scattered survivals created a new challenge. when the text began reappearing in respectable settings centuries later, disguised not as contraband but as literature. Because the next chapter in its journey would see it transform from a persecuted heresy into something even more dangerous, a fashionable philosophical curiosity. The forbidden text didn't just survive through hiding, it thrived by masquerading as something else entirely. Imagine a troubadour strumming a lute in a crowded tavern, singing what sounds like a typical love ballad. The audience sways along, unaware that every chorus contains a coded verse from the banned manuscript, its radical theology disguised as heartache. This was the genius of literary camouflage, taking ideas too dangerous to state plainly and dressing them in the respectable clothing of poetry, folklore, or even cookery. One particularly clever adaptation surfaced in a collection of Provençal romances, where the text's critique of church wealth became a fable about a greedy hawk stealing from doves. To the casual listener, it was just another animal tale, but those familiar with the forbidden work recognized the hawk's jeweled talons as a stand-in for corrupt clergy. Similarly, a German manuscript of household tips included instructions for preserving summer fruit that, when read vertically, spelled out the text's arguments about eternal truths outlasting earthly powers. These weren't just translations, they were alchemical transformations, turning leaden heresy into golden entertainment. The text's chameleon-like ability to adopt local flavors made it nearly impossible to suppress. In Italy, where courtly poetry flourished, it appeared as a sonnet sequence about unrequited love, except the cruel beloved represented institutional religion. Scandinavian versions wove its themes into sagas of trickster gods, while Flemish editions hid its passages in the bawdy punchlines of Shrovetide plays. Each adaptation served two masters, entertaining the masses while secretly nourishing the initiated. Some of the most daring disguises blurred the line between sacred and profane. A French prayer book from the 1500s contained what seemed like standard Marian devotions until sung to a particular melody. The notes corresponded to letters revealing the forbidden text's most inflammatory lines. Another copy was smuggled inside a popular farce about a drunken monk, its pages deliberately stained with ale rings to appear well-thumbed and harmless. The censors' greatest weakness was their assumption that heresy would announce itself with fanfare, when in reality, it often wore the face of laughter or tradition. This literary subterfuge reached its peak with what scholars now call mirror texts, works that could be read two completely different ways depending on one's knowledge. A seemingly innocent pilgrimage guide to Compostela, for example, contained descriptions of roadside shrines that doubled as metaphors for spiritual independence when certain words were emphasized. The same passage might guide a devout peasant to Santiago while instructing a dissident in the art of intellectual self-reliance. Like a medieval magic eye painting, the truth only snapped into focus for those who knew how to look. The creativity extended to physical presentation. One surviving copy from Catalonia was bound with alternating pages of approved herbal remedies and forbidden philosophy. Flip quickly, and it looked medical, read slowly, and it became revolutionary. Another was printed in red and black ink, with the orthodox text in bold and the subversive commentary in faint crimson that faded over time, leaving only the safe version for inspectors. These weren't just books, they were sleight-of-hand performances where the real message always stayed one step ahead of the censor's grasp. What makes these adaptations so remarkable isn't just their cleverness, but how they transformed persecution into artistic innovation. Constraints bred creativity. The need to hide sharpened metaphors, the fear of discovery refined allegory. In forcing its protectors to think like poets, the text accidentally elevated itself from theological treatise to something approaching literature. A passage about divine justice became richer when expressed through a folktale's cadence. An argument against hierarchy gained emotional weight when voiced by a lovelorn knight. The very act of disguise deepened its message, proving that sometimes to tell the truth plainly is less powerful than to let it dawn slowly in the reader's mind. This legacy lives on wherever artists code dissent into pop songs or activists hide protest in street art. The medieval scribes who turned heresy into rhyme would recognize their spiritual descendants in every era where laughter, beauty, or tradition becomes the perfect cloak for revolution. Their greatest lesson wasn't just how to survive oppression, but how to make the struggle itself a kind of art. History remembers the monks and merchants who preserved the forbidden text, but some of its most ingenious guardians wore dresses, not robes. While men dominated official channels of medieval knowledge, women operated in the overlooked spaces where censorship rarely reached: birthing chambers, herb gardens, and private prayer corners. A noblewoman in 15th century Burgundy might commission an illuminated prayer book, its lavish borders hiding the text's radical verses between gilded flowers. Meanwhile, a village midwife recited its passages as healing charms during deliveries, embedding heresy into the rhythm of life's most sacred moments. These women transformed domesticity into dissent. Tapestries in castle chambers concealed embroidered phrases from the text within pastoral scenes. Recipe books for preserves and poultices included coded instructions for preparing ink to copy forbidden pages. Even children's education became a vehicle, mothers teaching letters by tracing the text's opening lines in hearth ashes, their lessons vanishing with each sweep of a broom. The very tasks society deemed unimportant, weaving, cooking, childcare, become perfect covers for intellectual rebellion. Oral transmission proved particularly potent. Unlike men who risked detection carrying manuscripts, women preserved the text in lullabies, folk remedies, and bedtime stories. A soothing melody about spring flowers might contain the text's core philosophy when sung with certain emphases. Herbalists passed along its verses as planting rhymes, ensuring each generation memorized them as naturally as harvest cycles. This oral tradition created an invisible archive no inquisitor could burn. Class barriers dissolved in this silent sisterhood. Duchesses and dairymaids found common cause, their social differences meaningless compared to the shared risk of preservation. When noble households hosted sewing circles, their embroidered patterns mapped safe houses for fugitive preachers. Peasant women trading eggs at market used specific counting rhymes to identify allies. These networks thrived precisely because authorities underestimated women's intellectual lives, assuming their conversations revolved around domestic trifles rather than dangerous ideas. Religious women proved especially resourceful. Beguine's semi-monastic laywomen copied the text into their private devotionals, disguising it as mystical visions. Nuns in convents slipped fragments into their illuminated choir books, knowing male superiors rarely scrutinized women's work. One surviving psalter from a Rhineland abbey contains the full text written in minuscule script between musical staves, its presence betrayed only by a single nun's diary entry centuries later, sang the forbidden words today as if they were praise. The text's survival through women's hands reshapes our understanding of medieval power. While kings and bishops made grand proclamations, their wives and sisters quietly subverted them. When a Spanish inquisitor interrogated a merchant's daughter in 1493, he recorded her defiant claim, "Truth has no gender." She might have added that preservation has many disguises, from the ink stains on a noblewoman's fingers to the lullabies hummed in smoky cottages, all keeping alive what others tried to erase. The forbidden text didn't just cross geographical borders, it leaped language barriers, shedding its scholarly Latin for the earthy rhythms of peasant speech. In the bustling markets of 14th century Florence, a scribe hunched over his work, painstakingly translating its phrases into Tuscan dialect. His challenge wasn't merely linguistic, it was cultural. How do you render a Latin critique of clerical corruption into terms a wool carder or blacksmith would grasp? His solution: swap abstract theological terms for visceral metaphors. Where the original condemned ecclesiastical avarice, his version spoke of priests fat as butchers' hounds. This wasn't careless paraphrase, it was strategic adaptation, ensuring the text's survival by making it resonate in taverns and fields as powerfully as it had in university debates. These vernacular translations didn't just democratize the text, they reinvented it. A German version circulating along the Rhine transformed its philosophical arguments into rhyming couplets, easily memorized by illiterate farmers. Passages about spiritual freedom became planting proverbs. Truth grows best when no priest treads the row. In northern France, the text morphed into a series of fables featuring foxes representing corrupt clergy and industrious ants symbolizing the faithful. Each translation wasn't a carbon copy, but a creative reinterpretation, the textual equivalent of a folk song passed orally, changing with each singer's voice yet retaining its essential melody. The act of translation became its own form of encryption. Authorities hunting for Latin phrases could miss their meaning entirely when rendered in regional slang. A notorious example comes from Bohemia, where the text's warning against false prophets appeared in a brewer's almanac as advice about spoiled hops. When the froth stinks of pride, toss the batch. Only those familiar with both brewing and the original text would catch the double meaning. This linguistic camouflage made the text nearly invisible to outsiders while keeping it vibrantly alive for local communities. Dialects shaped doctrine in unexpected ways. The Occitan version, infused with troubadour traditions, emphasized the text's mystical elements, portraying divine connection as a courtly romance between soul and creator. Meanwhile, the Middle English translation circulating in Lollard circles amplified its egalitarian themes, using the blunt cadences of peasant speech to demand, "Why should a ploughman's prayer be worth less than a bishop's?" These variations created a kaleidoscope of interpretations, all recognizably descended from the same source, yet each reflecting its cultural soil like regional wine vintages. The physicality of these translations tells its own story. Unlike lavish Latin manuscripts commissioned by nobles, vernacular versions often appeared on cheap parchment or even bark paper, their ink made from soot and berry juice. A surviving Catalan copy was written on the backs of discarded legal documents, its words crowding the margins of land disputes and tax records. These humble materials testify to the text's journey from elite circles to the hands of cobblers and dairymaids, a democratization of ideas that terrified authorities far more than any single heresy. Translation errors, or what scholars once dismissed as errors, reveal deeper truths. When a Flemish scribe confused the Latin sacerdos, priest, with saccus, sack, his version accused churchmen of being stuffed sacks of grain. Far from a mistake, this became a beloved local metaphor, appearing in peasant revolts for generations. Similarly, a northern Italian translator's decision to render divine light as noon sun on olive leaves wasn't theological negligence, it was genius, grounding abstract concepts in sensory experiences familiar to his audience. The text's metamorphosis wasn't limited to European languages. By the 16th century, fragments had reached the Middle East via Venetian merchants, where Coptic Christians translated them into Arabic as parables about the false Muqaddam. In Armenia, monks adapted its critiques into their own struggles against ecclesiastical corruption. blending it seamlessly with indigenous protest traditions. This global journey underscores a profound truth. Forbidden ideas refuse to respect the boundaries of culture or creed. Modern linguists have uncovered even more layers. Spectral imaging of a Welsh translation revealed erased glosses where the scribe debated word choices, showing active engagement with the text's meaning rather than mechanical copying. In Prague, a multilingual version alternated lines of German, Czech, and Hebrew not just for secrecy, but as a commentary on the unity of human aspiration across artificial divisions. These discoveries shatter the myth of medieval Europe as isolated and parochial, revealing instead a world humming with intellectual exchange. The ultimate testament to these translations' power lies in their imperfection. Unlike the sterile precision of modern academic translations, these versions pulse with life-awkward phrasings, regional idioms, even occasional doodles in the margins. A Bavarian translator's frustrated note beside a tricky passage, "God help me render this right," captures the very human struggle to bridge the gap between languages and worldviews. In their flaws, these translations became something greater than replicas. They became conversations stretching across centuries, each scribe adding their voice to an unbroken chain of dissent. What began as a survival tactic rendering the text into language's censors didn't bother monitoring became its unexpected strength. Like a plant propagated through cuttings, each translation put down roots in new soil, adapting to local conditions while keeping its genetic blueprint intact. The text didn't just survive translation, it thrived because of it, proving that the surest way to kill an idea isn't to translate it, but to leave it trapped in a single, unchanging form. The 18th century dawned with Europe's intellectual landscape transformed where once the forbidden text had been hunted, now it was hunted for. Antiquarians rummaging through dusty monastery libraries and aristocratic collections began noticing peculiar similarities between seemingly unrelated fragments. A German scholar named Johann Brucker made the first crucial connection in 1724, spotting identical marginal symbols in a Provençal love poem and a Latin herbal manual. His curiosity sparked a scholarly scavenger hunt spanning decades, as researchers slowly realized these scattered pieces weren't random heresies, but parts of a single, meticulously crafted work. What followed was history's quietest revolution, the rehabilitation of dangerous ideas into academic respectability. French bibliophile Pierre Dupont spent 17 years tracking down variants, discovering that a bawdy drinking song from Burgundy and a stern moral treatise from Utrecht shared the same philosophical core. His groundbreaking monograph, published in 1751, proved these weren't just similar texts, they were the same text in endless disguise. Suddenly, Europe's intellectual elite found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. The heresy their ancestors had tried so hard to erase had not only survived, but flourished right beneath their noses. The methods these scholar detectives employed would feel familiar to modern forensic investigators. Paleographer Maria von Essen developed a technique for identifying scribble, fingerprints, and tiny quirks in letter formation that revealed when different copyists had worked from the same original. In Oxford, a team led by Reverend Thomas Whitfield chemically analyzed inks to prove 3 manuscripts from different centuries shared a common source. Their work peeled back layer after layer of deception, revealing how medieval scribes had tweaked wording and shuffled passages to evade detection while preserving the text's essence. This scholarly resurrection came with profound ironies. Many fragments were found in the personal collections of bishops and cardinals, their ancestors having confiscated the texts only for descendants to treasure them as historical curiosities. The Vatican Library itself yielded several key pages, misfiled for centuries among accounts of saintly miracles. Even more startling was how often the text had been preserved by its enemies. Inquisitors' manuals quoting long passages as examples of heresy became crucial sources for reconstruction, their condemnations accidentally ensuring the very ideas they sought to suppress would endure. As the puzzle pieces fell into place, a new narrative emerged, not of a fringe heresy, but of a work that had shaped European thought in ways no one had imagined. Enlightenment philosophers found their own arguments about individual conscience prefigured in its pages. Historians traced its influence on peasant revolts and religious reforms previously considered spontaneous. The text that had once terrified authorities now fascinated scholars as a masterclass in intellectual resistance, its very survival proof that no suppression could be absolute. The ultimate vindication came when the first critical edition was published in 1789. The same year, another revolution began in Paris. Printed openly under academic auspices with footnotes instead of flames, the forbidden text had completed its journey from criminal contraband to historical artifact. What made this transition remarkable wasn't just the change in status, but the realization that the text's greatest trick hadn't been hiding from power. It had been waiting patiently for power to change its mind. Today, the forbidden text sits comfortably in university libraries and Kindle stores, no hidden compartments, no secret handshakes required. You can download a fully annotated critical edition before your morning coffee, or flip through digitized medieval manuscripts with a swipe of your finger. This digital liberation would astonish the scribes who once risked their lives to preserve a single fragile copy. The British Library's online portal offers high-resolution scans of palimpsests where their erased words still linger beneath the surface, now visible through multispectral imaging that those medieval monks couldn't have dreamed of. But this accessibility comes with its own ironies. The same technology that democratizes the text also flattens its history. When you read a polished modern translation on your tablet, you miss the tactile clues that once signaled danger, the uneven vellum where a nervous scribe scraped too hard, the faint wine stains from hurried midnight copying sessions. Digital platforms prioritize convenience over context, often divorcing the text from the very materiality that shaped its survival. A 15th century copy hidden inside a hymnal tells a story through its wormholes and repairs. A PDF can't whisper about the hands that smuggled it. Scholars now grapple with unexpected challenges born of this digital abundance. How do you authenticate a text that exists in countless variations across repositories from Tokyo to Texas? The definitive edition, compiled by a German press in 2012, differs markedly from the crowd-sourced version on a controversial history wiki, each reflecting editorial choices as consequential as any medieval scribe. And what happens when an algorithm recommends the text alongside conspiracy theories, divorcing it from its nuanced historical context? The same democratization that fulfills the text's original mission also risks diluting its complexity into clickable sound bites. Preservation has taken on new dimensions too. Where monks once fought mold and bookworms, archivists now battle digital decay, corrupted files, obsolete formats, even the fading of inkjet prints on permanent archival paper. A team at Cambridge recently discovered that certain digitized manuscripts stored on early CDs from the 1990s are already unreadable, their data silently crumbling like medieval parchment left in damp cellars. The text that survived 6 centuries of active persecution now faces passive threats, not flames but forgetting in the cloud's endless expanse. Yet the digital age has also resurrected lost fragments. In 2019, a researcher cross-referencing auction records with a Belgian monastery's inventory discovered a mislabeled leaf in a New York private collection, its significance overlooked until machine learning matched the watermark to known copies. Another breakthrough came when a Vatican archivist noticed that ultraviolet light revealed faint ownership marks on a confiscated volume, leading to the identification of 7 dispersed pages in Prague and Seville. These high-tech detective stories continue the medieval tradition of piecing together the text's broken journey, just with spectral imaging instead of candlelight. The internet's global reach has sparked unlikely revivals too. A Reddit thread dissecting the text's coded symbols led to a Canadian musician composing an album based on its hidden melodies. In Seoul, a collective of calligraphers now recreates its most beautiful disguised copies as protest art against modern censorship. Even its survival tactics inspire digital activists. Encryption activists cite the medieval scribes' layered manuscripts as spiritual ancestors to their work on onion routing and steganography. The text's ethos, it seems, adapts as readily to firewalls as it once did to inquisitors. But perhaps the most profound change is how digitization has transformed who gets to interpret the text. For centuries, its meaning was guarded by initiates who decoded symbols under threat of death. Now, a high school student in Mumbai can compare 12 variants with a few clicks, while a retired nurse in Brazil blogs about finding parallels in indigenous resistance poetry. This radical accessibility fulfills the text's original promise, that knowledge belongs not to institutions but to anyone willing to engage deeply. Yet it also raises questions. Without the weight of historical struggle, does the text lose some of its power, or does its message grow stronger when freed from the aura of danger that once surrounded it? As we scroll through its pages on backlit screens, we're left with a paradox. The text's digital life has achieved what its medieval protectors dreamed of: global dissemination beyond any power's control. But in gaining the whole world, it risks losing the grit and grain of its extraordinary journey. Those wine-stained margins and knife-trimmed edges weren't just accidents, they were the texture of resistance. The challenge now is to honor both the text's hard-won accessibility and the fragile human hands that passed it forward, one dangerous copy at a time. The forbidden text's fingerprints appear in places its medieval scribes could never have imagined, woven into the very fabric of modern thought. When Voltaire penned his scathing critiques of religious dogma in the 18th century, he echoed arguments nearly identical to those hidden in 14th century manuscripts. A striking parallel emerges between the text's assertion that no man owns the keys to heaven and Diderot's Enlightenment-era declaration that reason is the only true priesthood. These weren't conscious borrowings. The philosophers likely never held a copy, but rather proof that certain ideas, once unleashed, follow similar paths through human consciousness across generations. Literature absorbed the text's themes just as deeply. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, often called the first science fiction novel, mirrors the medieval work's warnings about knowledge without wisdom. Both stories ask, what happens when humanity pursues divine power without divine responsibility? The creatures lament, I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, could have been lifted straight from the forbidden text's passages about ambition's perils. Even the novel's fragmented narrative structure, with stories nested within stories, recalls the medieval practice of dispersing dangerous ideas across seemingly harmless texts. Modernist writers took up the torch in subtler ways. Kafka's The Trial, with its nightmarish vision of opaque authority, channels the text's ancient frustration with institutional hypocrisy. That famous courtroom scene where Joseph K. is condemned by unseen judges, it's a direct descendant of the medieval critique that justice wears a blindfold not to be impartial, but to avoid seeing its own corruption. The parallels aren't coincidental, they are evidence of how certain truths keep resurfacing, regardless of era or censorship. philosophical movements show even clearer lineage. Existentialism's emphasis on individual meaning-making finds an eerie precursor in the text's insistence that each soul must build its own stairway to heaven. Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead follows a logical path from the medieval work's quieter suggestion that empty rituals are God's tomb. Even the structure of these later philosophies reflects the text's methods, presenting radical ideas through aphorisms and parables rather than systematic treatises, ensuring they'd stick in the mind like burrs. The connections grow richer when examining political thought. John Locke's theories about natural rights borrow phrasing startlingly close to the text's assertion that no king's decree can alter what the stars wrote at our birth. Rousseau's social contract finds its emotional counterpart in the medieval argument that true law is written not on parchment, but in the pulse of the people's blood. These resemblances suggest the text didn't just survive, it seeped into the groundwater of Western thought, nourishing intellectual movements centuries later. 20th century counterculture embraced the text's spirit without knowing its name. Beat poets like Allen Ginsberg championed the very individualism the medieval work had risked everything to defend. When Jack Kerouac wrote "Burn, burn, burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles," he might as well have been describing the scribes who kept copying despite the flames. Even the psychedelic movement's quest for unmediated spiritual experience mirrored the text's rejection of religious intermediaries, a case of ideas circling back to their origins across 600 years. Science fiction and fantasy became unexpected carriers of the text's DNA. Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, with its anarchist moon colony, plays out the medieval vision of voluntary spiritual communities. Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy resurrects the text's most controversial idea that questioning authority isn't just permissible but sacred. These modern allegories prove that certain struggles transcend their historical moments, finding new relevance in every generation's language. Perhaps most telling is how the text anticipated postmodernism's central insight, that truth is often found in margins and disguises. When Derrida wrote about the instability of meaning, he unknowingly echoed the medieval scribes' practice of hiding truth in palimpsests and coded symbols. That scholarly fascination with what's erased or hidden, it's the academic equivalent of holding a manuscript to the light to reveal the writing beneath. The forbidden text's greatest legacy isn't in any single quote or idea, but in its demonstration of how knowledge persists, like a river that occasionally dips underground only to resurface miles later. Its currents fed intellectual movements that seemed entirely disconnected from their source. Those medieval scribes hunched over candlelit parchments couldn't have imagined their words would shape debates about artificial intelligence or climate ethics, yet here we are, still wrestling with the same essential questions about power, truth, and human dignity they first dared to ask. The academic world's relationship with the forbidden text is anything but settled. What some hail as a masterpiece of medieval dissent, others dismiss as a patchwork of corrupted fragments and later embellishments. At the heart of the debate lies a simple but explosive question: how much of the text we study today actually reflects its original form? Manuscript forensists have uncovered troubling discrepancies, entire paragraphs that appear in some copies but vanish in others, suggesting deliberate alterations by scribes or even later interpolations by collectors seeking to enhance its mystique. A notorious example emerged in 2014, when spectral imaging of a complete 15th century edition revealed that nearly 20% of its pages had been subtly rewritten to align with Reformation-era theology, blurring the line between preservation and propaganda. Authorship disputes fuel even fiercer clashes. For decades, scholars attributed the text to a shadowy figure known only as Magister H, referenced in a handful of Inquisition trial records. But recent linguistic analysis suggests multiple writing styles woven together, some passages dripping with scholarly Latin, others rough with vernacular proverbs. This has led to a radical new theory. What if the text wasn't penned by a single rebel, but stitched together by an underground network, each contributor adding their voice like patches on a quilt? Detractors counter that this romanticizes what's more likely a case of careless copying over centuries, with scribes accidentally blending unrelated works. The text's very purpose remains contested. Traditionalists insist it was always a theological grenade meant to destabilize church authority, but a vocal minority, led by Cambridge historian Elena West, argues it began as an academic exercise, a hypothetical, what-if debate common in medieval universities that later escaped its ivory tower confines. Her team points to a 13th-century Parisian lecture catalogue listing a disputed topic eerily similar to the text's core arguments. If true, this transforms the text from intentional heresy to intellectual curiosity gone rogue, a distinction that reshapes how we interpret its impact. Archaeological finds have further muddied the waters. When a cellar renovation in Strasbourg uncovered a previously unknown fragment in 2019, its carbon dating placed it 2 centuries older than the accepted, original copies. The fragment's content, however, diverged sharply from later versions, lacking the inflammatory anti-clerical barbs that made the text infamous. Traditionalists seized on this as proof the text evolved through radicalization. Revisionists fired back that perhaps those later editions were the work of overzealous copyists, not the initial author. The battle plays out in peer-reviewed journals and conference halls, where a single footnote can spark years of scholarly skirmishing. Even the text's influence divides experts. Some point to peasant revolts and Reformation pamphlets as proof of its revolutionary power. Others note that most medieval people couldn't read Latin. So how could an obscure manuscript truly inspire mass movements? This debate took an unexpected turn when linguists discovered that many vernacular protest songs and folk tales from the period contain metaphors traceable to the text's core ideas, suggesting its influence flowed through oral channels long assumed lost to history. The controversies reveal less about the text itself than about our own preoccupations. Each generation of scholars projects its anxieties onto the parchment. Cold War-era academics saw it as a blueprint for resistance against totalitarianism. Today's researchers debate its relevance to digital age censorship. The text has become a mirror, reflecting whatever cultural battles we find most urgent. Perhaps its true genius lies in this very adaptability, not as a fixed set of ideas, but as a vessel forever being reinterpreted, ensuring its survival not just across centuries, but across wildly different worlds of thought. From shadowy medieval scriptoriums to the glowing screens of Hollywood, the forbidden text's journey took an unexpected turn when it became pop culture gold. Imagine a blockbuster film where a rugged archaeologist deciphers cryptic symbols in an ancient book. Chances are that fictional tome owes its DNA to this real-life manuscript. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code might be the most famous example, with its plot about hidden messages in religious art echoing the text's actual history of coded survival. But the parallels run deeper than fiction. Brown's villainous monastic conspiracy mirrors the very forces that once hunted the real text, proving truth really can be stranger than allegory. Video games have embraced the text's mystique even more boldly. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, players uncover fragments of a forbidden manuscript that grants hidden wisdom, a direct nod to the way medieval readers risked everything for this knowledge. The game's animus glitches even mimic palimpsests, with layers of history bleeding through like erased words on parchment. Meanwhile, indie darling Pentiment turns the act of medieval scribble work into a murder mystery, its ink-stained protagonist uncovering truths that powerful institutions would rather keep buried. These digital homages do more than entertain. They introduce millennials and Gen Z to the thrill of historical descent, one quest marker at a time. Literature's love affair with the text spans genres. Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose features a deadly monastery library straight out of the manuscript's own survival story, while Catherine Neville's The Eight reimagines its symbols as clues in a centuries-spanning treasure hunt. Even children's books like The Inquisitor's Tale distill its essence into tales of daring resistance, proving the text's themes transcend age. What makes these adaptations fascinating isn't their accuracy. They take wild creative liberties, but how they preserve the text's core spirit, the idea that some truths are worth hiding and worth finding. Television has turned the manuscript into the ultimate MacGuffin. The librarians featured an episode where the text's symbols unlock a vault of dangerous knowledge, while Supernatural wove it into lore about angelic civil wars. These shows tap into the same cultural nerve that once made peasants memorize fragments, the allure of secret knowledge that could topple empires. Even anime like Vatican Miracle Examiner borrow its aesthetic, with dramatic close-ups of vellum pages revealing world-shaking secrets in crimson ink. The text's pop culture reinvention raises delicious ironies. Medieval authorities burned copies to erase its ideas. Now, Netflix algorithms recommend shows inspired by them. Scribes once hid it in hymnals to avoid detection. Today, its name dropped in best-selling novels displayed in airport bookstores. This transformation from hunted heresy to commercial commodity would astonish its original guardians, though they might appreciate how thoroughly their enemies' descendants have failed to contain its influence. What makes these fictional versions matter isn't historical fidelity, but how they keep the text's legacy alive in our collective imagination. Every time a gamer deciphers a virtual manuscript or a TV detective follows its symbolic trail, they're reenacting the same curiosity and defiance that kept the real text burning through centuries of suppression. The parchment may have become pixels, but the thrill of uncovering forbidden truth remains timeless. 600 years ago, scribes sewed forbidden words into the bindings of hymnals. Today, activists embed protest messages in blockchain transactions or hide dissent in gaming chat logs. The medieval guardians of the forbidden text would recognize their spiritual heirs in every encrypted email, every steganographic meme, every decentralized server keeping controversial ideas alive beyond any government's reach. What makes their story so urgently relevant isn't just the parallels between ink and pixels, but the timeless playbook they perfected for outmaneuvering censorship, adaptation as survival. Consider how the text's decentralized networks foreshadowed modern resistance tactics. Where medieval merchants smuggled fragments in wine barrels, today's digital dissidents use mesh networks and burner phones to share information when internet access gets cut. The text's survival relied on no single copy. When authorities burned one, 10 others existed in scattered locations. Sound familiar? It's the same principle behind peer-to-peer file sharing, where deleting a video from one platform only amplifies its spread across others. Both eras prove a universal truth: centralized control crumbles against distributed persistence. The text's disguises find eerie echoes in today's information wars. Medieval scribes hid radical theology in love poetry. Modern journalists bury sensitive reporting in entertainment blogs or code whistleblower revelations as fiction. A TikTok dance trend might carry protest choreography, just as 15th-century folk songs carried encrypted heresy. Even the text's visual symbolism, hidden in doodles and watermarks, resurfaces in digital activism, where protesters use fashion colors or umbrella patterns to coordinate under authoritarian surveillance. The tools change, but the instinct to cloak truth in banality remains humanity's sharpest shield against oppression. What truly unsettles power structures across centuries isn't the content of dissent, but its mutability. Church officials chasing the forbidden text faced a nightmare every time they adapted their search methods. The text adapted faster. Today's firewalls and algorithms battle similar shape-shifting foes. When China blocks VPNs, citizens turn to live streaming sermons with coded political commentary. When Twitter bans hashtags, activists communicate through shared Spotify playlists. Like the medieval text's ability to morph from Latin treatise to peasant proverb, modern resistance speaks in whatever language slips through the cracks. The text's history exposes censorship's fatal flaw. It's fundamentally reactive. Authorities always play catch-up, banning yesterday's tactics while innovators invent tomorrow's. Medieval inquisitors never anticipated heresy hiding in embroidery. Modern regimes struggle to pass dissent buried in cryptocurrency transactions or AI-generated art. This asymmetry gives truth a permanent advantage. The censor must block every possible channel, while the dissenter only needs one to remain unblocked. The forbidden text's 6th century run proves that when ideas evolve faster than barriers, oppression inevitably loses. Yet the parallels also reveal sobering vulnerabilities. The text survived partly because medieval Europe lacked panoptic surveillance. A monk in Spain couldn't be monitored by a bishop in Rome in real time. Today's digital dragnets threaten that anonymity advantage, with facial recognition and data tracking making hiding far harder. But here's where the old strategies still guide us. Just as the text's guardians used regional dialects to evade Latin-literate censors, modern encryptors exploit tech giants' blind spots by using platforms they consider commercially insignificant, obscure forums, gaming voice chats, even smart appliance data streams. Most powerfully, the text's legacy teaches that censorship often fuels the very ideas it tries to extinguish. Its medieval persecutors unintentionally created a martyr effect. Banning certain phrases only made people more curious to learn them. Modern platforms repeating this mistake watch in frustration as banned topics trend harder in private chats. There's a profound lesson here about human nature. Declare something forbidden, and you gift it irresistible allure. The text thrived not despite persecution, but because of it, a reality every would-be censor from the Inquisition to Silicon Valley eventually confronts. Perhaps the greatest gift the medieval scribes offer our digital age is their long-game perspective. They didn't expect to overthrow the church in their lifetime. They simply ensured the ideas survived for future generations to rediscover. In an era of viral outrage cycles, this patient resistance, planting seeds that may bloom centuries later, feels revolutionary. Their real triumph wasn't outsmarting the censors of their day, but making certain that no matter how many parchments burned, the conversation would continue. That's the ultimate survival strategy, ensuring the last word never gets spoken. After surviving flames, censorship, and centuries of secrecy, the forbidden text now faces enemies its medieval protectors never imagined. Not torch-wielding inquisitors, but the slow, silent killers of time itself. The very materials that once safeguarded it have become threats. Parchment made from animal skin reacts with air to form destructive acids, eating away at inked letters like invisible termites. A 15th century copy in Munich State Library shows this decay in heartbreaking detail, where once bold black script proclaimed, "Truth shines brightest when oppressed," now only ghostly brown traces remain, the words dissolving into fragile lacework. Even the ink meant to preserve the text now conspires against it. Iron gall formulations prized by medieval scribes for their permanence are ironically oxidizing through pages like slow-burning fires, leaving behind voids where radical ideas once blazed. Digital salvation presents its own paradoxes. High-resolution scans capture every hairline crack and ink blot with stunning clarity. Yet these files face obsolescence as formats change and storage media degrade. A cautionary tale comes from the British Library's early digitization project. Dozens of manuscripts photographed in the 1990s now languish on unreadable floppy disks, their contents trapped behind technological walls as impenetrable as any monastery's gates. Unlike vellum that can last a millennium if stored properly, current digital storage has an average lifespan shorter than a medieval scribe's career. The text that outlasted book burnings now risks vanishing into the cloud's fragile embrace. Neglect poses a more insidious threat than any chemical reaction. As the text transitions from dangerous contraband to academic curiosity, fewer hands feel compelled to protect it. Curators in Prague report visitors walking past its display case without a glance, drawn instead to flashy, illuminated Bibles. This complacency mirrors how the Dead Sea Scrolls were nearly lost not to persecution, but to disinterest, left crumbling in jars until a shepherd's chance discovery. The forbidden text's greatest modern peril isn't suppression, but the assumption that its survival is guaranteed after 6 centuries of beating the odds. Conservation labs have become the new front lines in this ancient battle. At Yale's Backlash Library, technicians use space-age materials to combat medieval decay. Japanese kozo paper, thinner than human hair, repairs torn folios, while climate-controlled vaults maintain conditions rivaling the text's original hiding places in cold monastery cellars. One ingenious technique borrowed from Renaissance forgers involves injecting gelatin between parchment layers to stabilize flaking ink, a modern twist on the very methods once used to create fake relics. These efforts walk a tightrope between preservation and authenticity. Overzealous restoration risks erasing the marginal notes and stains that tell the text's human story. The wine splashes from a scribe's interrupted meal, the teardrop that smudged a line about persecution. The race against decay has uncovered unexpected blessings. Multispectral imaging developed to recover faded passages has revealed layers of lost history, early drafts scratched out with knife points, secret symbols hidden beneath illustrations, even traces of the scribe's fingerprints in original ink mixtures. At Oxford's Bodleian Library, ultraviolet light recently exposed a shocking find. Beneath a seemingly blank in paper lay a perfect impression of the text's banned title page, transferred like a fossil from some long-destroyed copy pressed against it in a medieval bookbinder's workshop. These accidental survivals remind us that every act of destruction leaves traces, and every attempt to erase truth creates new forms of evidence. What makes these preservation challenges so poignant is how they mirror the text's own themes. Its central metaphor that ideas persist through adaptation now applies to its physical form. Just as medieval scribes translated Latin into vernacular dialects to keep the message alive, today's conservators must migrate digital scans to new platforms before old ones vanish. The text that preached resilience now depends on our willingness to reinvent the ways we protect it, proving that survival is never a one-time achievement, but a continuous act of reinvention across generations. The forbidden text's journey didn't stop at Europe's borders. It hitched rides on merchant ships, nestled in pilgrims' satchels, and even crossed oceans hidden in the personal effects of explorers. By the 16th century, fragments had reached the Americas, where they took root in unexpected soil. Spanish missionaries arriving in Mexico brought libraries of Orthodox texts, unaware that a single volume in their collection, a seemingly innocuous commentary on the Psalms, contained palimpsest layers of the forbidden work beneath its surface. Indigenous scribes, already skilled at preserving their own suppressed knowledge through pictograms and oral traditions, recognized a kindred spirit in these hidden words. Soon, Nahuatl translations blended the text's critiques of European hierarchy with local resistance to colonial rule, creating a fusion that would echo in uprisings for centuries. Across the Atlantic, the text found fertile ground in Africa's intellectual hubs. In Timbuktu, where scholars had long debated theology in the shadows of the Sahara, the text's emphasis on personal interpretation resonated with Islamic traditions of ijtihad, independent reasoning. Manuscripts smuggled along trans-Saharan trade routes were carefully copied into blank spaces within Quranic commentaries, their ideas sparking theological debates that still simmer in West African universities today. A surviving letter from a 16th-century Malian scholar praises the text's pearls of wisdom, though he prudently avoids naming it directly, referring instead to that which comes from the north like a hidden breeze. Asia proved equally receptive. Jesuit missionaries in Ming Dynasty China inadvertently carried the text's influence when they adapted its arguments about spiritual autonomy to make Christianity more palatable to Confucian scholars. The resulting synthesis, known as the accommodation method, borrowed heavily from the text's playbook, presenting Christian doctrine through classical Chinese philosophy. Meanwhile, in India, Portuguese traders introduced fragments to Goa's vibrant interfaith circles, where Hindu and Muslim thinkers wove its themes into Bhakti poetry and Sufi mysticism. A stunning example survives in a 17th-century Rajasthani manuscript that renders the text's core message as a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna, proving how seamlessly forbidden ideas could cross cultural membranes. The text's global spread wasn't just about content, it was about format. Armenian refugees fleeing Ottoman persecution sewed fragments into the linings of illuminated gospel books, creating literal layers of meaning. Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain carried it to Thessaloniki, where scribes transcribed it into Ladino using Hebrew characters, adding commentary that linked its ideas to Kabbalah. Even the icy expanses of Scandinavia absorbed its influence. Rune stones in remote Swedish villages bear cryptic inscriptions scholars now recognize as Nordic adaptations of the text's most famous maxims. What made this border hopping possible were the text's chameleon-like qualities. In Ethiopia, it merged with Coptic Christian traditions about the Ark of the Covenant. In Japan, hidden Christians Kakyo Korishitan encoded its passages into seemingly Buddhist prayer scrolls during centuries of persecution. Each culture didn't just translate the text, they reinvented it, like a melody played on new instruments. A particularly striking example emerges from colonial Peru, where Quechua weavers incorporated the text's symbols into traditional tunics uncuñas. To Spanish authorities, these were mere decorative patterns. To Andean villagers, the geometric designs mapped out the text's arguments about spiritual freedom in the language of knots and colors. The text's global afterlife reveals a profound truth about forbidden knowledge. Persecution often fuels dissemination. Every time authorities in one region cracked down, refugees and traders carried the ideas farther afield. The very forces meant to contain the text became its unwitting delivery system, scattering seeds across continents where they hybridized with local traditions. This accidental globalization created something unprecedented, a medieval intellectual underground that stretched from Icelandic scriptoria to Javanese courts, proving that no border could fully barricade the human hunger for contested truths. Modern technology is now uncovering these far-flung connections in startling ways. Spectral imaging of a Mongolian Buddhist sutra from the Yuan dynasty recently revealed traces of the text's Latin phrases beneath layers of scraping, likely the work of a Nestorian Christian scribe serving in Kublai Khan's multicultural court. In Zanzibar, archaeologists excavating an old Omani merchant's house found Arabic marginalia referencing the text's ideas, scribbled in the notebooks of a 19th-century clove trader. Each discovery adds another thread to the tapestry, showing how ideas we think of as European were always part of a much wider conversation. Perhaps the most poignant testament to the text's universal appeal lies in its absences. The erasures and silences speak volumes. The missing pages from a codex in Goa that Portuguese inquisitors burned, the suspiciously blank spaces in a Korean annals where scholars suspect censors removed references, the mysterious fire that destroyed a legendary cache of manuscripts in Timbuktu in 1812. These gaps map the text's influence as clearly as any surviving copy, tracing the contours of fear and fascination it provoked across hemispheres. Today, as scholars piece together this globe-spanning journey, the text challenges our parochial views of history. Its story isn't just about how ideas spread, it's about how they transform, and how the most dangerous thoughts are those that refuse to stay where power wants them. From the llama wool tapestries of the Andes to the palm leaf manuscripts of Kerala, the text's legacy whispers the same rebellious truth. Knowledge belongs to whoever dares to claim it, regardless of borders, languages, or laws. Every legend leaves fingerprints on history, but few have smudged the truth as creatively as the myths surrounding this forbidden text. One persistent tale claims the manuscript was penned by an angel who disguised himself as a wandering monk, a story that first appeared in 17th-century occult circles and stubbornly persists today. The reality, forensic analysis of ink pigments confirms the text was written by entirely human hands, likely multiple authors over decades. Yet the angel myth reveals something profound: how people needed to believe the text's radical ideas couldn't possibly have earthly origins, that only divine intervention could explain its daring challenge to authority. Another exaggeration paints the text as a medieval bestseller, secretly read by every literate person in Europe. While its influence was undeniable, literacy rates in the 14th century hovered around 10% for men and far lower for women. The text's true power came not from mass readership, but from strategic dissemination, copies passed among key individuals who amplified its ideas through sermons, songs, and oral traditions. This myth speaks to our modern obsession with quantifying influence through sales figures, missing the subtler ways ideas permeated pre-industrial societies. Perhaps the most damaging misconception is that the text advocated violent revolution. Inquisitors promoted this view to justify brutal crackdowns, pointing to passages about tearing down rotten structures. But linguistic analysis shows these lines were metaphors for spiritual renewal. The original Latin uses architectural terms common in mystical writings about rebuilding one's soul. Later translators, whether through error or agenda, weaponized these metaphors. The tragic result: entire peasant uprisings cited the text as inspiration, while its actual message of non-violent inner transformation got buried beneath bloody misinterpretations. Fanciful origin stories abound. A popular 18th-century theory claimed the text was smuggled from Constantinople after the city's fall, carrying lost Byzantine secrets. The timeline doesn't hold. The oldest fragments predate the Ottoman conquest by decades. But this myth persists because it fits a romantic narrative of brave scholars rescuing wisdom from infidel hands. The truth is far less cinematic. The text was likely born in the lecture halls of Paris or Bologna, its radicalism emerging from academic debates rather than exotic Eastern influences. Modern conspiracy theories add new layers of distortion. Some allege the text contains encrypted scientific knowledge, blueprints for flying machines, or cures for plague. that the Church suppressed. While intriguing, spectral imaging reveals no hidden schematics beneath the ink, just more theological commentary. This myth reflects our tendency to project contemporary fascinations onto historical artifacts, imagining medieval people as stewards of futuristic secrets rather than thinkers engaged in their own era's urgent debates. Even the text's physical form attracts exaggeration. Tales describe copies bound in human skin or written in blood-grotesque details that first appeared in 19th-century Gothic novels. The reality, most surviving copies use standard parchment and iron gall ink. These macabre legends say more about Victorian sensationalism than medieval bookmaking, transforming a philosophical work into a horror prop. The most persistent falsehood is that the text survived through sheer luck. This underestimates the deliberate, sophisticated networks that preserved it, the scribes who perfected concealment techniques, the merchants who risked their livelihoods smuggling fragments, the noblewomen who used their privilege to shield dissident thinkers. Reducing 6 centuries of meticulous resistance to luck dishonors their calculated courage. Separating fact from fiction matters because these myths distort how we understand intellectual resistance. The angelic origin story implies real people couldn't conceive such bold ideas. The violent revolution narrative justifies historical persecution. The lucky survival trope erases centuries of strategic sacrifice. When we peel back the legends, we uncover something more inspiring: ordinary humans demonstrating extraordinary commitment to preserving inconvenient truths. The text's mythology also reveals how societies process uncomfortable histories. The Byzantine rescue fantasy lets Europe frame itself as civilization's savior rather than acknowledging its own repressive tendencies. The suppressed science myth allows us to feel superior to medieval people rather than recognizing similar censorship dynamics in modern patent wars or climate research disputes. These aren't harmless stories, they're lenses that refract the past to flatter the present. Perhaps the greatest misconception is that debunking myths diminishes the text's wonder. The opposite is true. Knowing real scribes hid messages in quilt patterns is more astonishing than any angelic legend. Understanding how generations outsmarted oppression through wit rather than supernatural aid makes their legacy more relevant, not less. The truth doesn't strip away magic. It reveals magic of a different kind, the kind ordinary people can recreate when they refuse to let ideas die. In a world drowning in tweets and terabytes, the 600-year saga of this forbidden text offers something startling, a masterclass in how truth endures. While our modern battles over censorship play out on social media feeds and encrypted messaging apps, the medieval scribes who preserved these dangerous pages faced far greater risks with far fewer tools. Yet their strategies disguise decentralization, relentless adaptation feel eerily familiar to anyone watching today's digital resistance movements. The parallels are impossible to ignore. Just as the text hid in illuminated initials and butter molds, modern activists embed protest messages in video game code or hide whistleblower documents in blockchain transactions. Both eras prove a timeless rule: when you can't outmuscle power, you outthink it. What makes the text's survival so relevant isn't just its historical drama, but what it reveals about human nature. That same itch for forbidden knowledge that drove medieval peasants to memorize fragments now drives us to click, view deleted Reddit posts, or hunt for restricted academic papers. The tools have changed, but the instinct remains a stubborn refusal to let gatekeepers dictate what we're allowed to know. Consider how quickly suppressed videos spread through mirror sites, or how leaked documents multiply across servers faster than authorities can take them down. We're all unwitting heirs to those medieval scribes, proving again and again that ideas are viral by design. the text's legacy also holds up a mirror to our illusions of progress. We like to believe that with the internet, censorship has become impossible, yet authoritarian regimes today employ algorithms that make the Inquisition's book burnings look clumsy by comparison. China's Great Firewall and Russia's sovereign internet demonstrate how digital barriers can be far more effective than physical ones. But just as the text slipped through cracks in medieval surveillance, modern workarounds, from mesh networks to steganography in cat memes, show that oppression and ingenuity will always be locked in their ancient dance. The battlefield has shifted from parchment to pixels, but the war remains the same. Perhaps most powerfully, the text challenges our assumptions about what deserves protection. In an era where we casually delete old emails and overwrite cloud storage, its 6th century journey asks uncomfortable questions. What truths are we failing to preserve? What inconvenient ideas are we letting dissolve into digital oblivion because they don't fit current algorithms? The scribes didn't just save a book, they safeguarded a worldview. Their example urges us to look beyond today's trending topics and ask which unpopular but vital perspectives we should be embedding in the cultural equivalent of hymnbook margins and quilt patterns. The text's ultimate lesson is one of humility. However advanced we think we've become, its story reminds us that every generation believes it's fighting unprecedented threats to truth. The medieval monks fretting over heresy hunters, the Enlightenment thinkers dodging royal censors, the journalists today facing spyware and slap lawsuits, all were certain their era's challenges were uniquely dire. Yet the forbidden text whispers across the centuries that the game never really changes. Power will always fear inconvenient ideas. Those ideas will always find ways to hide, mutate, and resurface. And somewhere, right now, someone is stitching today's dangerous truths into the fabric of ordinary things, trusting that future eyes will know how to read them. Look around your own digital landscape with that medieval scribe's imagination. The encrypted messages hiding in Instagram photos, the protest slogans disguised as gaming slang, the banned books saved as NFT metadata. These are our era's butter molds and loom weights. The text's enduring power lies not in its specific words, but in its demonstration that no suppression system is foolproof, no orthodoxy permanent. However tightly the present tries to control the narrative, the future will always rummage through its attics and find what it was told to forget. From the flickering candlelight of medieval scriptoriums to the glow of modern e-readers, this forbidden text journey is more than a historical curiosity. It's a masterclass in resilience. Think about it. No armies protected these ideas, no vaults sealed them away. Their survival depended on something far more powerful, the quiet determination of ordinary people who believed certain truths were worth risking everything to preserve. A nun stitching fragments into her habit's lining, a merchant smuggling pages in wine barrels, a farmer etching phrases into his plow handle. These weren't revolutionaries by trade, but they became guardians of thought simply by refusing to let the flame go out. What's truly remarkable isn't just that the text survived, but how it thrived by adapting to every new threat. When authorities burned manuscripts, it lived on in memory. When the Inquisition hunted Latin copies, it morphed into folk songs and embroidery patterns. Like water finding cracks in stone, the ideas flowed wherever repression hadn't thought to block. This adaptability holds a mirror to our own digital age, where banned books resurface as PDFs shared through mesh networks, and protest art hides in plain sight as viral memes. The tools change, but the game remains the same. Truth refuses to be contained. The text's legacy challenges us to reconsider what's truly unbreakable. Empires built on force and fear crumble. Rome's legions, the Inquisition's dungeons, all eventually dust. Yet a handful of inked parchment scraps, passed hand to hand with whispered warnings, outlasted them all. That paradox should give us pause today. In an era of mass surveillance and algorithmic suppression, we're tempted to think resistance is futile. But history whispers otherwise. The mightiest walls are no match for human creativity. When a Venetian scribe hollowed out a bishop's staff to hide a single page, or a modern activist encodes secrets in blockchain transactions, they're playing the same timeless game and winning. This story also reshapes how we view history itself. The official records, the chronicles of kings and papal decrees, tell only half the tale. The rest lives in the margins, quite literally. Those doodles in a monk's psalter, the odd stains on a tax collector's ledger, the seemingly random notches on a weaver's loom, these were the real archives of Dissent. They remind us that what gets labeled as heresy in one age often becomes common sense in another. The same church that burned the text's copies later housed fragments in its own libraries, proving that even the fiercest opponents can't hold back the tide forever. So what other hidden histories might be waiting beneath the surface, between the lines of mundane documents, behind the paint of old masterpieces, or encoded in traditions we take for granted? The forbidden text's greatest lesson is that truth never disappears. It just learns new disguises. Every generation assumes it's uncovered all the secrets, only for the next to peel back another layer. Maybe that's why this 600-year-old story feels so urgent today. In a world where information seems both omnipresent and fragile, where tweets vanish into memory holes and news cycles erase yesterday's scandals, the text's survival whispers a counterintuitive hope. The more you try to erase something, the more forms it learns to take. The scribes who preserved these pages couldn't have imagined their words would one day flash across screens worldwide. Yet here we are, still piecing together their puzzle, still marveling at their ingenuity. That continuity is the real magic, not some dusty artifact behind glass, but the unbroken chain of curiosity and courage that stretches from their time to ours. So the next time you encounter a story that's been buried, or an idea someone wants to silence, remember, you're holding the next link in that chain. The question isn't whether truth will survive, but what extraordinary shape it will wear